Good morning, folks. Here we are at what has usually is left and right, but because there's really nobody sitting here on the left, perhaps we should call this show Right, and Right. I think I'm more conservative than you are, but maybe not by much if I am. It depends on the issue, yes. So we don't have our usual signs up. This is Tony Zore, who's a radio personality at WMWV. He's been on here before. He fills in very nicely for us and on occasion. So here he is, and this is the day after the election, the big election nationwide, and in our he's a New Hampshire person, and I'm a Maine guy, and so we're going to discuss these things, and so and whatever else may come up, you know, it is prompted by a remark by you or by me. So we have some questions here from our producer, and we'll start in on number one. A two-part question. Challenging. If Nancy Pelosi is elected as Speaker, will that hurt or hinder Democrats in 2020? And then the second part is, what's your assessment of Paul Ryan's tenure as Speaker? How about the first one? Do you think Nancy Pelosi is going to hurt the Democrats or help her?
I think as an organization, they're probably going to be helped. I mean, she's a seasoned veteran. She knows what she's doing as far as the party goes. So it's not like they're getting somebody who's inexperienced. She's been around for quite some time. I think the big challenge when it comes to Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats in general is they need to get more new faces. Because if you look at the presidential elections, like who are we talking about? We're still talking about Biden. We're still talking about Hillary. We're still talking about Bernie Sanders. So we're seeing the same faces over and over and over again, and it's a very small handful of people. So I think that's what the big challenge the Democrats are facing is they really need to foster more young people into the party rank, not just as voters. And I mean, this past election in New Hampshire may have helped out with that since they've won so many seats. That might help foster some stars in the local crowd, and maybe some of those will head up to the national ranks as well.
Have any particular ones in mind that particular Democrats and local Democrats in New Hampshire?
I mean, I can't.
Might be, huh?
I don't know. I don't know. We'll see what happens.
Pelosi, I agree with what your assessment of her as an experienced veteran, knows the ropes and has, you know, she rammed through Obamacare, and that showed some political acumen. But that was 2009 or 10, and here it is, you know, 8-9 years later, and there's some question about, you said she's, you know, the Democrats are getting old. Well, she is, and not just wrinkly, but I think she might be losing it, you know, mentally. I mean, I can't call a specific one or point to one now, but I remember seeing a montage of things that she had done, or sometimes she just loses whatever it is she's talking about and be and so that's concerning for some Democrats. I think as a conservative and lately Republican, I guess I'm still on the rolls. I found out yesterday as a Republican, and I have to. I don't know if I'll resign or not. Maybe I'll leave it on there for a while. I used to resign and then I'd join it again when prior to a primary. But
right.
Anyway, I think she's going to be helpful for Republicans just by being there and being spacey, and also she's a San Francisco Democrat, so she's on the radical fringe.
Well, I think on that account, the Democrats, they have their party platform, and she's very good for that party platform. If you're a Democrat, you probably really like Nancy Pelosi because she is rank and file with those types of issues, and the way she talks about issues, it's really talking to that select crowd of Democrats. As far as reaching out to moderates, Nancy Pelosi isn't going to be helpful to the Democrat Party any more than Trump's helpful to Republicans for reaching out to moderates. It's kind of take it or leave it. I think one of the big things that not Nancy Pelosi faces, but the Democrat Party faces, is they've really kind of created a niche crowd for themselves by going for nationalized health care, by going for national versions of these issues, instead of going to the states and saying, in this state, this is what's popular, so we're going to push this in this state. By nationalizing everything, they're isolating themselves to the more urban populated crowds. And that means that California is going to be much more catered to in the Democratic Party. San Francisco and those types of urban areas are going to be more catered to. Meanwhile, one of the reasons why you saw such a contentious primary last time was Bernie Sanders is more of a rural candidate. And I think the rural candidates in the Democratic Party are being left behind. People who more focus on agriculture than they do the hardcore gun rights. Because Bernie Sanders called Hillary out for being as hardcore as she was, wanting to prosecute gun manufacturers for things they were not responsible for, because she had proposed that they be liable for misuse of their product, and he said that's ridiculous, which he was right in doing so. But it kind of shows that divide between urban liberals who want to appeal to that more city-based lifestyle and rural Democrats who might not be opposed to government help, but also don't want the city lifestyle to be forced federally. And I think that's going to be something that the Democratic Party needs to sort out.
There was a guy in, I'm not sure there are any moderate Democrats anymore. So when you said that Nancy Pelosi is not likely to appeal to moderates, were you thinking of independents, or were you thinking about this, what I would think,
I think both.
Extinct moderate, are they moderate Democrats?
For the most part, I tend to agree that a lot of Democrats tend to no longer be moderate because of things like socialized health care or single-payer health care. So in that sense, you don't have moderation. In the sense that I think a lot of voters who tend to vote Democrat like the idea that government is going to have some sort of limited program there, so they don't buy into the Republican free market or libertarian free market ideal, but at the same time they don't buy into single health care. That's what I'm talking about, that middle group who think that you can have it both ways. Whether or not you can, I'll leave it up to the viewer, but that's, I think, what I'm talking about when I say moderates, are people that don't choose one side or the other philosophically, they just want it to work. I
don't know if I mentioned earlier that he is a libertarian, Tony is, and that I find it's fun to talk to somebody who is not Democrat, not Republican, yet invested in the political process, but has a different perspective. And it's and I find I don't think I've ever spoken to a libertarian who wasn't a thoughtful person about government. I mean, they've studied it, I think, and have an understanding of the process constitutionally and otherwise, and philosophically, than your average Democrat knows about, what the Democrat Party represents. Or Republicans tend to be a bit more, educated in those ways, I think.
In some ways.
In some ways.
In some ways. Sometimes they go completely off base, but.
Okay. Which is why you're not a Republican.
Which is why I'm not a Republican.
All right. Yeah. The other part of the question, which is, what is your assessment of Paul Ryan's tenure as Speaker? You want to tackle that, or should I? I
think he's had a hard job, especially being the Speaker of the House the years that he was Speaker of the House. Paul Ryan, I think it's important to note, when Paul Ryan was chosen as Speaker of the House, he didn't want to be Speaker of the House.
True.
They had to drag him kicking and screaming to take up that position. Mm-hmm. And I think his retirement isn't simply him being like, well, now this is where I am family-wise. I think he just never wanted that position to begin with. He sat in it because the party needed somebody to sit in it. He paid his dues, and now he's like, I'm done because I've paid my dues, I've done my part, somebody else has to step up.
Not only is he done being Speaker, but he's done being a congressman.
Right.
And he was tired of the process, as it would seem like. I mean, I don't know what he wants to do next, but.
I think the funny thing about Paul Ryan is he's kind of vilified by everybody. Hardcore conservatives don't like Paul Ryan because he's had to take more moderate positions in order to find a consensus in the legislature to get things done. And that's kind of the nature of that position, Speaker of the House, is to find some consensus within the legislature. Liberals don't like him because he's been the mouthpiece for the Republican Party, and you don't expect liberals to like that because he's going to be espousing views that they don't like. But when we talk about Paul Ryan, like, what made his name in politics in the first place was his budget.
Yes,
the Paul
that's
Ryan
what
budget.
appealed to me.
And
Yes.
a lot of conservatives like that, a lot of Republicans, I should say, like that, because it was going to be reining in the expanse of government.
Yes.
Meanwhile, I know the Democrats at the time had been running ads of people being thrown off ledges because
grandma off the cliff, yeah.
because the government wasn't going to be spending as much.
Yeah.
And that's what I want to highlight is that Paul Ryan has always been a moderate. And that budget is a perfect example where he wasn't cutting funding in actual dollars. He didn't cut a single dollar. What he cut was the expanse of government. In other words, when the government does a budget, they do it by percent of GDP. So when they say we're going to spend this amount on education, they're saying we're going to spend like 3% on education or 10% on education. They say it by percent of GDP. So what Paul Ryan did...
Percent of GDP, a percent of the total federal budget?
To my knowledge, it's percent of GDP, but
Really?
I may be.
I think it's about the budget.
Go ahead. It may be about the budget. To my knowledge, the whole budget.
Which is about $4 trillion now, right? The federal budget. I
mean, I'd have to look at the numbers again.
I think it is close to that. Yeah.
But the point being that when he did the budget, what he was doing was he was cutting the percentages, which wasn't actually cutting the dollar per dollar spending. It was simply cutting the rate of growth for those dollar per dollar spendings. So if you're a libertarian like me, if you're a hardcore hawk when it comes to financial matters, he was slowing growth of debt. He wasn't cutting any debt, but slowing the growth of that spending. So for, I think, the hardcore conservatives on financial issues and for libertarians, he was very much a moderate. He wasn't anywhere near where we want the actual spending to be cut so we don't have debt spending.
Okay, so I think that's insightful, what your analysis of him going from a fiscal hawk to a moderate. The issue that you didn't touch on, which I think is precious to Democrats, I mean to conservative Republicans like me, like the Tea Party caucus, I tend to identify with them, and immigration. I mean, he has always been so-called. What was it that when George W. Bush was pushing it, comprehensive immigration reform, which to me was euphemistic for amnesty. I mean, and he fought those battles during both the Bush administration and the Obama administration that are being against funding any kind of wall. He would pay lip service to border control, but wouldn't put up any money, and really, in my opinion, wasn't true to that, both before he became Speaker and after. But but I did respect him during the Obama years when he would argue about limiting the budget and about looking at Social Security and Medicare, the two biggest items, that are expanding the federal deficit and ultimately the debt. And he was very articulate on that. He was a real numbers cruncher, and an effective debater. That disappeared. I mean, you mentioned that he was dealing in percentages and so forth, but as a conservative, I would look at, is this government program necessary? And just yes or no, and how much fat is there in this, and how much superfluous stuff, and how about consolidating some of these departments, especially intelligence? I mean, how many are there? 12, 14 different intelligence agencies, and
right,
and things like that. That's what you would tend to go after if you're going to be a capable administrator or oversight to the executive, and so he's disappointed me all this time. I think he's a good man. I think he's a good family man as well, and that's important. I think he's sincere. He doesn't set off my BS alarm like so many of them do on there. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
Well, I was going to point out two things. One, again, that falls to him having to reach the consensus in the legislature. Now that he's a speaker, he can't just represent the people. He's charged with representing the party and also getting things done. So you go to that more moderate place when you're a speaker. unless you're going to just go to war with everybody, in which case it's going to be shut down budgets, and we know what that's like. It's going to be interesting now because the Democrats have the House, Republicans have the Senate, and I think what we're going to see is the Democrats are going to continue the expansive spending that we've seen. They're going to try to rein in the military spending, however. And I think that in and of itself is kind of a good thing. As a libertarian, I think that's kind of a good thing.
And chairman of the House Finance Committee is guess who? Maxine Waters. Imagine that, huh? How that's going to be. Woo.
That's gonna be it's gonna be fun. Fun to watch as a libertarian because I get to hate on everybody. Because the Republicans, as much as they talk about cutting budgets, when have they cut budgets? Like they've had the presidency. Like I mean,
I can't remember. I can't think of it.
You shouldn't be able to remember because the last time we really had significant cuts in the budget was Calvin Coolidge. So it's like that's really the last time we've had significant actual cuts in the budget was under Calvin Coolidge. So that you're talking about the 1920s at that point. And I think Americans are addicted to spending, no matter what party's in charge, and unless of course we get the libertarians who are actually going to cut actual government programs like you're talking about, you're not going to get the cuts in spending. And the Democrats, if they can find it in themselves to put together budgets that they can get the Republicans to agree on, you're just going to get a lot of financial spending pushed through at this time.
Right. All money bills have to originate in the House.
Yes.
But then they have to be approved in the Senate, or they have to be approved by, some committee that with representatives of both bodies, and then they have to be signed by the president. So I just don't see anything happening for the next 2 years. I mean, Trump has veto power. I can't see what the Senate and the House are going to agree on.
It's a hard call because we're in uncharted territory. We're not simply looking at the Democrats as they were under Bush, which was pretty contentious times. We're looking at Democrats as they are under Trump, which is a lot more contentious. He's a trigger. You either like Trump or you hate him. And Democrats obviously hate him, and he triggers them a lot. So whether they're going to be able to work with him, even with things they agree on, I think will be an interesting process going forward, because it may just be that we have shut down governments just like under Obama, where the Republicans were going to shut down the government because they disagreed fundamentally with X, Y, and Z, and therefore they're not going to work on the rest of this just because of X, Y, and Z. It might be the same case with the Democrats now that they control the House.
Which is what happened, I think, with Obamacare, when it was repealed but not replaced, and it was not fully repealed.
It's not fully repealed. We still have ACA.
Only incrementally, and it was the final vote was John McCain, and he voted against a replacement plan. And and that sunk it. And was it on the merits of the plan itself, or was it out of spite because of this hatred of Donald Trump? We can't know what was in the man's mind, and now he's dead. But it would seem, I think you could make a case that it was out of spite that he voted against it.
I don't know. I don't see. John McCain and Trump did not get along very well. But at the same time, John McCain and Trump got along very well when it came to foreign military spending. So I'm not sure if he would veto something out of spite if he sincerely agreed with it. I don't see that as being part of John McCain's character, even as much as him and Trump hated each other. Trump ran on a platform of cutting military spending, on getting us out of Syria, getting us out of a lot of these foreign interventions. We haven't
cutting military spending? I don't think so. Trump not. I mean,
Well, if you're cutting our intervention in Syria, I assume we're cutting spending as well.
He did run on that. Yes.
If we're cutting out of Afghanistan, I assume we're cutting the amount of spending that we're going into Afghanistan.
Yes, that's safe to assume. But he looked at our Navy as depleted. He looked at our Army as depleted, and he looked at the armaments wearing out, and he did propose to increase spending to improve that.
I'll give you that.
Okay.
Foreign intervention spending.
Yes, and I'll give you that. He seems to have backed away from that. I mean, he was good about limiting his spending on ISIS. Go ahead and take out ISIS, but don't go further with it. But now Afghanistan, why does he stay there? Just he could lead the movement out, just get us out. Because what's the point now? It's just.
That's the $1 million question. $1 trillion question, I think, at this point. Especially for Afghanistan, we're losing it. We're
certainly not winning.
We're losing ground. Even in conventional terms, the Pentagon has been really bad about these reports. There's a really good website, longwarjournal.com. It's put together by Defend Democracy, which is a think tank, and they basically take a lot of ex-military analysts and they look at what's going on in the war of terror. And they're not biased one way or the other. They give you a clear.
And they don't answer to the chain of command.
They don't answer
to
the question. They'll give you the Pentagon reports and they'll explain why they're accurate or inaccurate. And the Pentagon has been.
That's a good site. You have to write that down.
And the Pentagon has been lying, essentially. They've been talking about.
I'm shocked.
They've been talking about, and you hear CNN and Fox News and all of them, they talk about peace talks with the Taliban tribes. And that's something that the Pentagon has been asserting since Obama, is peace talks with the Taliban tribes. The problem with that is the Taliban has the condition of you leave Afghanistan and then we'll talk about peace. And that's a precondition that they've held even to this day. In other words, you lose and then we'll talk about leaving you alone. That's the Taliban position. So the nonsense about peace talks with the Taliban right now is exactly that. And the Pentagon actually paid a lot of money to somebody who was claiming that they were a leader of the Taliban and willing to negotiate with them. And the guy strung them along, and we lost a lot of government dollars in that enterprise under the Obama years. Whether or not that's going on right now with somebody else, I don't know. But the territories that we hold in Afghanistan are overrun constantly, and we've lost essentially, I think, either a third or half the country to Taliban forces.
And I hate to paraphrase a saying by John Kerry, who I seldom agree with on anything, but how would you like to be the last American soldier to die in Afghanistan? He said that about Vietnam. But no, it's whenever I hear about these American soldiers blown up by an Afghan official who with a suicide bomb attack or vehicle attack, and jeez, let's just get out. And anyway, that's a visceral feeling. Okay, so we went off on a tangent there. It often happens.
A little bit.
Often happens. So let's go back to local issues, and you being a New Hampshire resident, we're particularly interested. We talked a little bit over breakfast about the referendum questions number 1 and number 2, which passed. Could you elaborate on what those are and why you're glad they passed?
I'm very happy they passed, especially as a libertarian. Questions 1 and 2 were constitutional amendments, so they got passed by the legislature but needed 75% or more to pass in the state to become part of the New Hampshire Constitution. Both got over 80%. Question 1, which passed by a larger margin, was about amending the New Hampshire Constitution to be more accountable to the people. So what happens is, if the government passes a law and you think that law is illegal, you can't just sue the government, normally speaking, because you have to prove detriment to yourself. So you have to be damaged in some way by government action before you could say this is illegal. In a case with, say, for example, bump stocks, if you own a bump stock in New Hampshire and New Hampshire passes a law banning bump stocks, you can sue them saying this damages me personally because now I'm fined or arrested by this new law. If you don't own a bump stock, you can't charge the government. You can't sue the government until you're actually hurt by that law, even if you think it's unconstitutional or illegal for New Hampshire to do that.
Would you be concerned about, given this amendment, there'd be a rash of to clog the courts, lawsuits by ordinary citizens? Why not?
I'm not. And let me just, what it amended was it basically allows you to sue the government if you're a taxpayer. So let's say the government does something that you think is illegal, or they're spending money on something or being unaccountable to to the people because they're taking actions. You don't have to prove damages to yourself anymore. You could just say, this is wrong, this is illegal, this is...
I get that, yeah.
And then you could sue them. I don't think this is going to clog the courts because we're looking at a case where the courts themselves can reject the case if they want to. They can throw a case out and say, no, you don't have a claim here. Whether or not that happens going forward, we're going to see.
It'll have to be tested.
This is going to be tested. But I think in either case, even if it clogs the courts, it's still a good thing because we're talking about making the government closer to being consent of the governed. We're talking about people still consenting to what the government can do. And in cases where the government acts out of place, people now have a claim to saying you're acting out of place, even though it doesn't necessarily damage them outside of their taxpayer dollars going away.
Has there been anything like this in other states?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
This might be a test for the nation then, in the laboratory of democracy, so to speak. All right. How about question 2?
So question 2, I'm more excited about as a libertarian. It specifically added the wording to the New Hampshire Constitution, an individual's right to live free from governmental intrusion in private or personal information is natural, essential, and inherent. So it's very vaguely worded on purpose. And basically what you're doing is you're taking all the stuff that we have today in debate with the NSA and cookie information and metadata and all that sort of stuff, and we're saying this still applies with the Fourth Amendment. And that's really the essence of the Fourth Amendment is you have a right to privacy. If they're going to invade that privacy in your papers, in your person, in your home, in your property, the government has to get a warrant. Question 2 is basically saying you have a natural right to privacy that we now recognize in the New Hampshire Constitution, and the government cannot invade your personal data without getting a warrant or permission.
The government. Now, would that be
It
Concord?
specifically applies to the government, yeah.
But Concord or Washington?
Well, it applies to the New Hampshire Constitution, but it's a recognized individual right in the New Hampshire Constitution. So this will probably go to the Supreme Court if somebody sues them.
Okay, so if there's a FISA warrant issued on Tony Zore and they go into your stuff, are you going to be able to implement this new constitutional amendment?
I think that there's a case to be made there if I know that they have done it, and that's one of the problems with the FISA warrants is we're talking about secret illegal courts invading people's privacy.
Yes.
And that has included the president himself at this point in cases unrelated to terrorism.
Yes.
So obviously,
okay, we're on the same page there. Go ahead.
Obviously, that has violated even the intent of the bill when it was originally passed.
But my question is, this is a state constitution.
Yep.
And what about federal? Can it be binding on federal action in violation of this vague wording, as you say?
I think it really boils down to the people that inhabit the court, and that's if we go by the letter of the law, what the federal government does today is clearly illegal.
I agree.
If we go by
based on the Bill of Rights, Fourth Amendment.
Based off the Bill of Rights, the Fourth Amendment,
yes.
But the Constitution generally. If we go by the interpretation people have decided to place on it and ignore those direct wordings, or in some cases the intent behind the laws, then it could go either way. The Supreme Court could say, absolutely, this is an individual right that was recognized by the founders in the Fourth Amendment, and it was also recognized in the Bill of Rights when they say, you know, what doesn't belong in this Constitution to the federal government belongs to the states and the people themselves. So you can make a constitutional case saying that this absolutely applies. You can also say,
it's going to resurrect the 10th Amendment, we hope.
Right, well, we'll see.
Yes.
That hasn't happened in a long time, and it may just be the case where they say, well, we don't like that, so we're just going to ignore it. So, but I think it's an essential right that we need to recognize.
Yeah.
I think it's a natural right. Whether or not we recognize it or not, it exists, and people will follow that whether or not we recognize it.
It exists.
Yeah.
Because of what the Declaration of Independence said about where we get our rights. Or?
Well, it's a source of nature. Yeah, absolutely. When we look at rights, a lot of people tend to think of rights today as this artificial thing that the government does, and that's not what
does.
Well, like say for example, healthcare. A lot of people are arguing that healthcare is a right. So that's like an artificial.
All right, yeah.
That's an artificial
Yeah, I would
thing.
agree with that. Yeah.
A lot of other people say, "Oh no, well, it's a limitation on government, and it basically limits government action." That's where libertarians fall. What the founders looked at, in my opinion, and I think when you read their documents from James Otis and Thomas Jefferson and Samuel Adams and all of them, they talked about a state of nature that government is designed to protect, our natural liberties. And the fact is that, say for example on this, privacy, whether or not the government recognizes a right to privacy, people are going to hold that right to privacy. They're still going to be hiding things from the government.
Because of emanations from the penumbra, so
What?
to speak. Well, that comes from this case that in Connecticut on, I forget the name of the case. It was who versus who, but it was Casey, I think, versus state of Connecticut. Yeah, all right. So it was about contraception, and the state of Connecticut said married people are not allowed to use it or buy it at the time in the early '60s, and Casey said, yeah, you are, and it had to do with the Supreme Court ruling had this wording, because of emanations from the penumbra of the right to privacy, the constitutional right to privacy. Well, you can't find the word anywhere in the Constitution, but so then that particular wording was used then in to justify Roe v. Wade by the majority decision. So it became very important, and that's still contentious today. So
Absolutely.
I'm getting off on a sidetrack. I'm sorry.
But
were you done with the Second Amendment?
Well,
your question two thing?
Yeah, I mean the end point is that we're going to hide things from the government, and if the government's going to invade our private space, our private lives, they have to get a warrant in order to do so.
That's cool.
And that's
not a FISA warrant.
That's the intent. Yeah, no,
not private court.
An actual warrant that's not from a secret court with secret police invading your life without you knowing.
Okay. Okay. In Maine, in New Hampshire, we have the congressional seats. I don't know what happened in District 1. We had the Democrat maintain it. What happened in the other district?
New Hampshire went all blue congressionally.
All blue congressionally.
Yep.
Okay. And the only statewide office is the governor that would be held.
That
be
went
considered red.
Yep, that went Sununu.
Yeah. And by a small margin, you said?
No, Sununu actually did good. Not as good as people thought. In the polling, it looked like he was, 50 or 60 against 30. And then in the last week before the election, that really swung to be like 40 and 50. And that's where the election was his opponent Kelly ended up in the mid 40s, I believe, and Sununu ended up in the 50s. So I wouldn't call it a close election. It wasn't like 49 and 50. It was pretty decisive in Sununu's favor, and that's not surprising. He's been a moderate governor, and he's done a pretty good job thus far, which you would expect from somebody from a political family.
Locally, Gene Chandler lost. He's a Republican representative, and Bartlett, and Speaker of the House, member of the. You said somebody told us 37 years. I think it was our producer.
Yep.
In the legislature. I was surprised. I mean, he's been at this table before. I was hired to moderate discussions with Republican candidates, and sharp guy.
Yep.
And surprising. Anyway, I guess all of the local Republican reps were wiped out, replaced by Democrats. I'm not sure what that means. I haven't got my fingers on the pulse of New Hampshire legislative politics, but
I think no libertarian candidates were in the election, so this was really Republican Democrat as far as the vote goes. But I think a lot of the voters, this was a massive turnout, not just in New Hampshire, not just in Maine. Everybody across the nation was talking about voting lines being backed up to presidential election numbers. It was a huge midterm.
Yep, it was.
So
probably
I think,
record-breaking.
Yep, we'll see. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It definitely could be. I would not be surprised. And I was lucky enough because my name starts with Z, so I was able to skip the line. They told, like, Z's over here, and there was one person in front of me. So everybody else is back out the door, and I was able to walk to the front of the line almost, just because of my last name. But it was I think an indication that a lot of people are frustrated with the system more than anything else, because you're seeing a lot of people still being thrown out who are in politics or have been in politics for a long period of time.
Okay, thrown out.
And
Yep.
they're basically throwing out the people who are in charge. Whether that translates to we want what the Democrats want, we'll see, because there's been a long history with midterms representing we're frustrated with the people in charge, so we're going to throw them out for the other party. That doesn't necessarily mean they stand for the people who are being voted in and what they want. They simply don't like where we're going.
I want to bring up something that I really noticed this year, that which is, I went to bed at about 8:45. I mean, I did watch the returns up to that point, but there weren't very many, and I didn't need to know what happened, at midnight. I mean, the results would be available to me when I got up this morning at 5, and then I would read them, and then it wouldn't be any. We think this is. There's some are still undecided. They're so close, but I mean, I'm content to do. With presidential elections and these, but yet the hype everywhere I looked, and including the websites that I habitually visit. All of it was, and come over, watch us, watch us, for the up to the minute election coverage. And so, what for? What does it change that we know now or that we know 7 hours later? I don't get that. What do you think about that?
Do you follow any sports?
Yes, I'm a Patriots fan.
You're a Patriots fan. Do you say the Patriots are going to win or lose, whatever the score, when I wake up tomorrow morning, so I'm just going to wake up and then I'll find out what happens after?
Well, I like to watch the games. I like the individual athletes and so forth, but I won't stay up. And all these night games that the Patriots have had, I tried to stay up, but I can't.
But you can certainly understand why people do.
Okay, yeah, I can.
And when we're talking about elections, we're talking about all of the coverage about all the candidates being condensed into one continuous format, while you're seeing updates constantly about who's beating who, while we're talking about why they're beating them. So it's essentially the political game on election night.
It is, but that's not the only thing I'm interested in. So this has been going on. I mean, my typical place for national and international news would be from between 6 and 7. I'll watch Bret Baier, and then the rest of it I get online, and I don't watch other stuff usually. I'll flip over to MSNBC sometimes and see what the nutcases over there are saying and doing and whatever. And yep, okay, they're still as crazy as they were before. I watch Meet the Press on Sunday mornings, and anyway, it started a month ago, and it's been, every night I don't want to know anything about it. There's other stuff happening in the world, I'm sure. And not everybody's watching what's happening in the U.S. There's other stuff happening, and I want to know about what's going on, but I can't find it.
So I think for the average voter, you're not talking about somebody like you or me who pays attention to these issues and follows them and then decides on individual candidates. What you're talking about is somebody who hears the news once in a while, listens to news once in a while, but for the most part, when it comes on, they flip the channel. And this is the one night where they get to say, I was a part of this process, this is my action, let's see the result of it. And they have a personal investment in that.
Like I placed a bet because I just came from the polls.
Yeah, you place a bet, you're watching the wheel spin, and this is that. So I think there's an extra onerous to watch political content on election night.
Like a horse race.
Compared to regular nights and regular.
Okay, maybe that's okay. That fits, I guess. It's still okay. Now let's look at the big picture. And here's the other thing I noticed. 2016, the polls were way wrong when it came to national politics. Here in 2018, they were almost exactly right in what was predicted. That the Democrats would take the House and that the Republicans would maintain the Senate, and even the margins or the point spreads, if we were talking about a football game, were pretty close. And so why were they so wrong then, so right this time? that I don't understand that, but I noticed it.
It depends on who you're following. If you watched like specific channels, CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, you're going to see a lot of wrong polls back in 2016. If you look at something like RealClearPolitics, which is organization.
I'm familiar with it.
Okay,
yeah.
so RealClearPolitics, what they do for their polling is they don't have a RCP poll. They look at all the polls being conducted and create a poll of the polls.
Yeah.
It was pretty accurate to what happened in 2016.
Oh.
So I think there were a number of news organizations that got it wrong, and we didn't necessarily see that this past election because those news organizations tend to focus more on presidential races than midterms. And especially when you're talking about New Hampshire or Maine, they're not going to be focusing on New Hampshire or Maine. They're going to be focusing on swing states or states that are a little more vital, have a little more vote, a little more pull in the House as a factor. So I don't think those polls are going to be as impactful in our minds during the midterms.
I'll give a brief summary of what I know so far about what's happened in Maine. And the governor was LePage. He termed out. And now he's replaced by the Democrat Janet Mills, who was a former attorney general, district attorney, et cetera, a career civil servant or career political hack, depending on how you look at it. Sean Moody was a businessman, ran a series of body shops, and he was a Republican endorsed by LePage, and he lost by about 6 points, I think, last I looked. Congressionally, Angus King, the alleged independent, was reelected comfortably. So was Shelley Pingree in the 1st District, reelected comfortably, left-wing Democrat. But in my district, which is the 2nd District of Maine, the only Republican district, the only Republican congressman in all of New England was just barely hanging on, ahead by 1,000 votes. But because of this ranked choice voting thing, we're not going to know who the winner is until probably a week from now. And whether it's Poliquin or whether it's the Democrat Golden.
Is that because of ranked choice voting, or is that because of re-election? I mean, how many times have we had normal elections where somebody doesn't know until a week or even a month from now?
Well, in the Democrat primary for governor, Janet Mills, we didn't know that she was the nominee for the Democrats until almost a week later.
If you go back in American history, that's just something that's part of elections.
Well, yeah.
If it's close enough, you're going to have recount after recount after recount.
Okay.
Ranked choice actually arguably speeds that up because now you have separate counts instead of the recounts.
Okay. All right, whatever. I just don't like it.
I have to admit, as a libertarian, I'm a little biased towards ranked choice because it's something new, it's something experimental. I think Maine is the first state to apply it. We talked in breakfast.
I never did finish my research on my iPhone about whether we were or not. Yeah.
I think they are. It's been applied in some municipalities before, but not on a state level, in my knowledge.
And Maine voters know that it only applied to federal races, and it didn't apply. It applied in the Democrat primary, as I said, back in June. But all other statewide offices on the ballot, there was only one choice. I mean, well, no, there were more choices, but you can only vote one time. Whereas, for Poliquin, I voted for him. And I filled in the oval, and my second choice filled in that oval, third choice filled in the same oval for him 5 times. So that was strange, just to do that.
It's also the way they're doing it is different than the ranked choice voting I've heard of in the past, because there's multiple forms of ranked choice voting. They're talking about when there's recounts or it's close within a certain margin, what they do is they knock out the bottom candidates, and then votes for those bottom candidates go to their second choice or third choice as they retally the votes.
Yeah.
That's the way Maine does ranked choice voting.
It is, yeah.
In Europe and other places, they also have ranked choice voting. Doesn't always get applied that way. In other places, say for example, you pick your first, second, and third people, and then there's points per those amounts. So say for example, your first choice, they get 3 points. Your second choice gets 2 points, and then the third choice gets 1 point. And the idea is the person with the most points is the least hated rather than the most loved politician. And that's kind of another way of doing ranked choice voting.
Okay.
Whether or not you like it or not, I don't know. Whether it's certainly not been the American standard for voting. We've just kind of done, you choose who you like and then that's it. Whoever has the most wins. And that's been the American system of voting since the beginning. So this is an experimental thing. Third parties are excited about it because a lot of people look at candidates they don't like and say, well, I don't want that person to win, so I'm definitely going to choose this person. Ranked choice kind of balances that a little bit to give third parties more of a chance.
The referendums in Maine were all bond issues, and I'm not familiar with, except question 1 was defeated. I don't know what happened to the rest. Let's go over to the federal government, though. Now, we have the Democrats, as predicted, did take over control of the House. And there are 435 members of the House. So it's the largest single body in terms of numbers. The Senate was maintained by the Republicans, who have increased their margin somewhat, and there are still, Arizona I don't think is in yet, Montana isn't in yet, so maybe by even more than the 53 to 47 at least, maybe more, maybe a bigger spread. And of course, the president wasn't up for re-election. So we have three branches in our government: the executive, which is the president. We have co-equal branches: the legislature, which is the House and the Senate, and then we have the judicial branch, which is ultimately the Supreme Court, nine justices. But it looks like, even though Democrats have taken over the most crowded branch, it's still only 1/2 of 1/3 of the three branches of government. So it's not significantly powerful in that sense. However, and also, I think we have a Republican president and we have Republican Senate, then they can continue to influence the judicial branch with appointments and approvals in the Senate. And so that's galling to the left-wing Democrats, especially exhibited by the Kavanaugh situation. And so there'll be more and more conservative jurists in the lower courts, certainly. So that's, Republicans will continue to consolidate power over the next 2 years, likely. Democrats, however, will have subpoena power over the president. We're going to have Nancy Pelosi. We're going to have Elijah Cummings in the Oversight Committee. He'll be chairman of that. We'll have, Schiff is in the House Intelligence Committee. We'll have Maxine Waters as the Finance Committee chairman, and I forget who else. But they're going to be aggressively wielding their gavels and issuing subpoenas to President Trump, going after his taxes, supporting Mueller, whatever else. Any comments?
Yeah.
Go ahead. You're writing stuff down there. Go ahead.
Oh my gosh. One of the things that you mentioned, and this is just a side note, is a lot of people look at the different branches of government as equal. Certainly not what the founders wrote. Madison himself, when he introduced the Bill of Rights, said, we probably don't need to limit the executive because they're the weakest out of all the branches. Maybe. Whether or not that ended up being the case,
has not.
The idea of it certainly was, the intent was the executive was supposed to be an administrator of the law, and that's it. He's supposed to administer law. Likewise, the courts were supposed to be administrators of the law, checking and making sure this is, in fact, according to the law.
So you saw the Congress
so
as
the legislature was the most powerful branch in the founders' mind, which is why the First Amendment is worded the way it is, saying Congress shall make no law. The idea being the executive can't make laws about this since it's just administering law, so therefore the only one we need to limit is Congress. And that didn't end up being the case over time because of power grabs that have happened over the U.S. history. But the idea of co-equal branches is sort of a modern idea that is a little unfair to the intent in the writing of the Constitution, according to the people that wrote it. The Democrat gains, a lot of people were talking about this blue wave that was coming. And a lot of people are going to be talking about, oh, the blue wave didn't happen, and it's a mix of both. In the midterms, like we discussed earlier, in midterms, usually the people say, we didn't like what the other party was doing, but we don't like what this party's doing, so it swings the other way in midterms. You'd expect that.
Yeah.
That's where the blue wave comes from, is people are expecting the
Obama
Republicans.
Congress was wiped out in his first midterm, and Bush in the second term, midterms, he was wiped out.
And it has nothing to do with what the other party stands for. It has to do with, we don't like the direction that you guys are going since you all have all the power. We're going to basically check that power and swing the other way. And that's where midterms come in.
Yeah.
We were talking about these blue waves before the election, or people were, and that ended up not happening. But I don't think it's as bad as a lot of people are going to claim. They're going to say that this is, the blue wave never happened, therefore it's proving that President Trump's heading us in the right direction, and the Congress is obviously reflective of that fact that a lot of people support his agenda. Whether or not that's the case, I don't know. I do know this. The Republicans had a lot of seats, a lot more seats that were secure in this election for the Senate compared to the Democrats.
They did.
So when you look at the number of seats that were up for election,
Yes.
even though the Democrats didn't take the Senate, they did take more seats than the Republicans in the election. Same with the House, where the Democrats may not have had this huge majority in the House. They did take a lot more seats in their elections. So you did see a blue wave in terms of elections, even if that doesn't translate into power. That's because the rotation of the senators and the representatives was such that the Republicans were more shielded against this election.
Yeah, they were. We lost Nevada, I think, to the Democrats in the Senate. But is that all? I think that's all.
In the Senate, like I said, they did fairly well.
And we flipped a few. We flipped Missouri. We flipped Florida. We flipped Indiana. Go ahead.
But I think the end point, what I'm making, is that I think what's happening in the House and the Senate and all this type of thing, it's not reflective of the parties and what they're supporting. It's reflective of the people and what they're opposing. And that especially goes along with when you get into elections and you're seeing people say, it's not the case that I support this person so much as I can't allow that person to win. And a lot of campaigns are shaped around that because it's a very powerful motivator, and it even undermines. I
don't like Trump, but I hate Hillary. So.
And it's even powerful against third parties like libertarians or green parties, because if you're making the argument that you should support this person because of what they stand for, you have to convince a third party voter this is what they stand for and you should support it. If you make the argument that person's going to be horrible, then they might not support what your candidate does, but they'll support that candidate against what horrible things the other person might do.
Isn't that what the Democrats ran on, though? I mean, we don't really have a platform. We just hate Trump. So if you hate Trump, vote Democrat.
It's what both parties do. I think it's what all parties do, to be honest.
This time.
I think it's what all parties do, generally speaking. Both parties have what they stand for. Like Democrats, you could say that, and yeah, absolutely, that is a huge factor. That's PR.
Was there any other factor?
Yeah, absolutely. They were talking about about the healthcare. They were talking about the judges, the judicial, any of the issues that you could see a Republican on, you could see a Democrat on with the opposite opinion. So, like, say for example, Second Amendment. Very pro-Second Amendment. I'm a huge gun enthusiast. Democrats were absolutely running on, well, this is a threat to our children in schools. This is a threat to our religious centers.
I didn't hear a lot of that in the debate. Did you?
Not for New Hampshire. Certainly, I think in other states. I think
Florida.
It's also...
We did in Florida.
Yeah, Florida, absolutely. Yeah. It was huge in Florida because Florida's had a huge problem with this.
Right.
And that's, you can go either way on the gun debate.
I'm with you.
I think with New Hampshire, you have more of a pro-gun population, and you go to that rural that I was talking about, that rural dichotomy, where a lot of Democrats in New Hampshire or Vermont or Maine may support some gun regulation.
They have to survive politically.
But they still actually support gun rights to some extent, in the sense that they think you should have a hunting gun.
Do you think Bernie Sanders would be pro-gun if he didn't represent Vermont?
I think Bernie Sanders would placate the party. I don't think Bernie Sanders thinks of guns as much of an issue. I think he's focused on other issues.
Okay. Well, we got 5 minutes. Let's go with the other question, too. A record number of women won seats in the U.S. House. Do you think this is a trend for the future or a reaction to President Trump?
Well, we've been talking about it. I think this is them not liking where the country's going, and they're voting against where the country's going. And Trump, I think, is a huge indicator in and of itself because he triggers people. I think we had I don't know if we would have had a record turnout this election if Trump wasn't president.
I doubt it.
I think whether or not you like him or hate him, he certainly motivates.
He does.
And I think when we look at a lot of these elections and what gains the Democrats did make and what gains the Republicans did make, we're looking at reactions to Trump and reactions to where the government is going.
I never liked Trump. I don't like Trump, but I dislike Hillary more, and so I'm going to vote for Trump. But I also like some of what he said, and he did have a platform. He did say, I'm going to do this and this and this and this and this and this. And unlike most other presidents, he has done his best and actually accomplished this and this and this and this and this. And that's unusual. So it's I have become more of a fan of his. I'm still put off by his unnecessary blathering, which I think undercuts his own program. But and I still, as a person, I don't want to go have a beer with him. But I'm just going to vote. I intend to vote for him again in 2020. Even more so, with more enthusiasm than I did in 2016. Go ahead.
I think Trump's followed through on some things, and he's dropped other things, and I think that's pretty stereotypical for most presidents. For example, foreign policy, he hasn't followed through with that on.
We discussed that,
I'm still waiting for Mexico to pay for a wall, which is going to be a huge budgetary item as we continue forward with that.
You think?
Yeah, I mean, it's expensive. And it's
$20
going to be
billion.
It's going to be an ongoing
What's the number
cost.
I've heard?
I've heard different numbers.
Yeah.
Whether or not you believe one figure or another, we're talking about a wall that requires digital surveillance. A lot of places we're talking about digital surveillance.
Yes,
that means employing more people on the federal payroll to watch the cameras, more people to go out into the desert and catch those people, more drones to be flown and people to fly them. So you're talking about
so
you're
bigger
talking about
expense than the physical wall.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also part of an ongoing debate that we're having as a country, whether or not we're going to stop travel across the U.S. border. Something that's never been done, something that's never been a part of U.S. history before, something that's absolutely new. And I don't necessarily agree with that, but a lot of people do. And it's something that we're going to be debating a lot, I think, in the years to come, even after Trump leaves.
I support the wall. I visited Israel and had to cross through walls as I traveled from the West Bank and back and forth and into Israel proper. And they were effective. They were having an enormous problem with suicide bombers and other terrorist attacks in Jerusalem. They still have a lot of traffic between the West Bank and into Jerusalem because it's right there between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, which are only about 5 miles apart. And that's the most highly trafficked gate. So they do control who comes and goes, and they have a huge, very effective intelligence service identifying. And so it works there, but it's just because it's a microcosm. It's a small country, and we're talking here of a 2,000-mile border, and physical obstacles, a big river, deserts, and that's difficult.
We're not just talking about I don't know.
1 minute left.
We're not just talking about like a place like New Jersey or walling off a small state. We're talking about the United States. And we're not just talking about the Mexican-American border. We're talking about the Gulf of Mexico. We're talking about Florida. We're talking about essentially half the country on the bottom half. So it's a lot bigger than people give credit for.
Okay, yeah. The caravan isn't taking a boat, though.
Not right now.
No.
Would they be if we had a wall? I don't know.
All right, so we have very little time left. It's been nice to have, not just a left-wing Democrat on the other side. One more. Well, this is too big a topic. Maybe it did we gotta wrap it up. Okay, I got the signal. Anyway, thank you for coming, Tony, and
Thank you
for filling in for the second time. And maybe you'll smile if I should contact you again for a third time or whatever. I hope so.
Absolutely.
All right, been a pleasure to have you. Thank you very much, folks. See you in a couple of weeks with let's see, Gino. Gino will be back.